Germany have been issuing a stinging rebuke to the United States for what they're calling undermining the understanding that free trade should ultimately benefit all nations. The US President Donald Trump has imposed tariffs to make it harder for global manufacturers to export their goods into America and compete with locals who obviously will not face those tariffs. And it's going to be the first year that the G7 has a Gender Equality Advisory Council, known as the Council. Well, for more on the G7 summit, we now cross to our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is in Canada. Good evening to you, Sherwin. And of course, what we are seeing today, we heard that in a statement that we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa, he says he's going to use his time in Canada to engage with investors and to talk to business people in Toronto.
Two parts, essentially, Bongani, to the president's visit here in Canada. He arrives tomorrow morning, Friday morning, where he will land in Toronto, Canada, and that's the first leg of the trip, essentially, where he will engage with business and investment leaders. Of course, part of that $100 billion drive over the next 5 years. So that's part A of his visit. And then after those meetings early tomorrow morning, he will fly here to Quebec City, where we are. You see this wonderful multimedia media center where I'm standing, expecting some 2,000 journalists. And then from here, he will probably take a helicopter or a short flight to Charlevoix. Charlevoix is this summer retreat, about 2 hours drive from where we are. And this is where they will engage, particularly on Saturday, Bongani, around issues of climate change, particularly the ocean's economy. As you know, Pretoria has earmarked Operation Pakisa, which they launched in 2014. Essentially wanting to tap into the almost 4,000 kilometers of South Africa's coastline and look at some of the economic benefits that can be obtained from exploration, for example, possible oil drilling and gas exploration, the minerals that one finds on the seabed, coastal development, manufacturing from the oceans, and so very much an important growth pole. The ocean's economy really fitting very much into South Africa's drive in terms of job creation. Operation Pakisa is hoping to grow South Africa's economy to the tune of about $13.6 billion. That's about 177 billion rand, and create some 1 million jobs. So a very, very important discussion the president of South Africa hopes to have with the leaders of some of the most industrialized nations of the world.
Sherwin, the president has previously said that after a 7-year lull, this is a sign of renewed confidence in South Africa. That's why South Africa has been invited back to this summit. Is that correct, and how is he likely to be received there?
Well, I think the proof is really in the tasting of the pudding, if you will. I know that there was an interaction at the World Economic Forum, I believe it was, where President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met. And that, I think, is what this invitation to President Ramaphosa is born out of. But historically, South Africa has always been welcome at the G7. I think the last time, as you correctly mentioned, was Pravin Gordhan representing then President Jacob Zuma in 2010. President Jacob Zuma himself in 2009. But there is this element, whether you're talking about at the United Nations, whether you're talking about on the global scene, an element of goodwill. I think there is, if you talk to experts on the international scene, there's a lot of expectation from this new presidency. He talks about a new dawn. I think people are really waiting to see, certainly from an international perspective, if he can deliver on some of the rhetoric you're hearing from Pretoria. And of course, this also feeds into our Foreign Minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, the Minister of International Relations, arriving in New York later today as South Africa bids for that non-permanent seat of the UN Security Council. So a lot of eyes and a lot of attention on the new leadership in South Africa. Can they carry this goodwill forward and implement some of the changes they talk about? That remains to be seen.
And of course, as you alluded to a little earlier on, this isn't just about PR, it's about money. The president has said that they are going where the money is. There is this investment drive that you alluded to a little earlier on. And of course, we know that the president is due to host that investment summit in South Africa, aiming to raise, that small matter of R1 trillion in the next 5 years.
Yes, this is not pocket change, and I think a great deal of concern for the South African delegation is the current rhetoric and the current narrative we're seeing emanating from Washington. There's a great deal of talk here about the tariff increases that we're seeing on American allies from the United States. There was just a press conference. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is the first G7 leader to have arrived in Canada. He went straight to the Canadian capital of Ottawa, where he's had bilateral talks with the Canadian Prime Minister. And just a short time ago, Bongani, they had a press conference and some very, very firm words I want to read to you. To quote the French President Macron, I believe in sovereignty and cooperation. If we don't respond to these unilateral and illegal American decisions, we collectively renounce our sovereignty, he continues. But I believe also in cooperation, because trade wars aren't good for anyone, starting with the American worker. He goes on. Perhaps President Trump doesn't care about being isolated, but we as the G6 are a real force to be reckoned with. The G6, of course, this is a meeting of the G7, Bongani. Some of them are now referring to themselves as the G6 plus one, and I think that is a big concern for this United States president, is will his America first policy lead to further isolation from even America's closest allies, including Canada, one of their largest trading partners, one of their closest neighbors, and indeed the European Union.
All right, Sherwin Bryce-Pease there in Canada, in Quebec, with that report there. And of course, there's going to be much focus, as he says, on climate change as well. It's going to be very interesting to see how it all develops, of course, with Canada being on Donald Trump's doorstep, and he'll want to play to his